There are places on Earth that feel like they belong more to memory than to geography. Antarctica is one of them, a continent drawn in white silence, where even maps seem to hesitate at the edges. Over the years, people have claimed that older charts once showed more detail than what we see today. Some call them lost Antarctic maps. Others link them to unexplained expeditions, hidden routes, or forgotten versions of exploration history that no longer appear in modern archives. When you look at conspiracy theories for sleep, Antarctica often appears again and again, not as a place of fear, but as a place of unanswered questions that never fully settle. There are mentions of Operation Highjump, strange post-war expeditions, and old navigation sketches that some believe were later simplified or corrected. There are also whispers about weather control theories, atmospheric research stations, and quiet zones where very little is publicly confirmed. But tonight, we are not trying to prove anything. We are just sitting with the questions, letting them exist the way distant wind exists over ice fields no one visits. Because sometimes the most interesting part of a mystery is not the answer, but the feeling that something vast was once there, just beyond the edge of what we were told. And as you listen, you might notice how these stories don't demand belief. They only ask for attention, the kind of attention that slowly fades into sleep. There is something unsettlingly quiet about Antarctica on old maps, not the modern satellite versions we see today, but the older sketches, the ones that seem slightly uncertain around the edges, as if whoever drew them was working from memory instead of sight. Some people say there were earlier Antarctic maps that showed different coastlines, or routes that no longer appear in official records. Others connect these ideas to forgotten expeditions, or to government research programs that never fully explained what they were looking for in the ice. When you search for conspiracy theories for sleep, Antarctica appears like a recurring thought in the background of history itself. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent, like weather slowly forming over a distant ocean. And maybe that is why these stories stay with us at night. They don't demand belief. They only ask us to imagine what it would feel like if parts of the world were once known and then quietly unlearned. It's strange how a map can feel like a memory, even when you know it isn't one. A sheet of paper, ink drying in quiet lines, becomes something heavier the moment you stop looking at it as a tool and start looking at it as a record of what someone believed the world looked like. Long before Antarctica had the clean white shape we recognize today, it existed in fragments, not as ice, not as certainty, but as empty space. Cartographers in earlier centuries often treated the unknown not as absence, but as something waiting to be described. Sometimes they left it blank, sometimes they filled it with guesses, and sometimes they drew coastlines that feel oddly familiar, even when we are told those coastlines could not have been known yet. There are old discussions in historical mapping circles about early world charts like the Peary Rise map. Some researchers point out distant southern land hints. Others explain it as misinterpretation, distorted projection, or recycled source material from older, incomplete navigation records. Both explanations exist side by side, and neither fully erases the curiosity the image creates when you first see it. And maybe that is where these stories begin, not in certainty, but in the moment your mind hesitates. Because once a map suggests something, even faintly, it is very hard to unsee the suggestion. In modern conspiracy theories for sleep, Antarctica often enters the conversation through this exact doorway, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet inconsistency, a shape that seems too large to have been unknown for too long, a coastline that feels like it should have been seen earlier than recorded history allows. But if you stay with the historical record itself, without adding anything to it, the story becomes softer. Early navigation was not a science in the way we understand it now. It was closer to accumulation. Sailors brought back fragments of coastline sketches. Others copied those sketches. Some copied copies of copies. Over time, accuracy and imagination could drift into each other without anyone noticing immediately. A coastline might survive on a map for decades simply because no one had reason or ability to redraw it. So when we look back now, through the lens of satellite imagery and digital precision, those older maps can feel almost dreamlike. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete in a way that feels meaningful in hindsight. Antarctica itself remained largely unreachable for so long that it became a kind of blank authority on maps, a place defined more by absence than presence. Even its early conceptual outlines were shaped by theory before exploration. The idea of a southern landmass existed in some scientific thinking long before it was confirmed in physical expeditions. That idea alone is enough to explain why older maps sometimes feel like they are reaching towards something they cannot fully define. And still, for some people, that is not where the curiosity ends. They look at those early depictions and wonder whether something was observed and then forgotten, or recorded and later simplified, or seen in a way that does not match what modern geography accepts. These thoughts often circulate in quiet corners of the internet where conspiracy theories for sleep are shared not as arguments, but as atmospheric stories meant to be listened to slowly, almost like background noise. There is a certain comfort in that style of thinking, not because it is necessarily accurate, but because it allows uncertainty to remain soft instead of sharp. If you look at how maps were made in the age of exploration, you start to notice how much depended on trust. One navigator would trust another's notes. One expedition would rely on earlier coastal impressions. Instruments were improving, but still limited. Longitude, in particular, was notoriously difficult to calculate accurately at sea for a long time. Small errors became large distortions, and those distortions were not always corrected immediately. So a map was never just a reflection of land. It was a reflection of communication between humans trying to agree on what they had seen. And Antarctica, being so remote, existed at the edge of that agreement. There is something almost quiet about that idea, that for centuries, a continent could sit at the bottom of the world not as a known object, but as a collective hesitation. Even the word unknown feels too confident for it. It wasn't unknown in the way of mystery novels or hidden stories. It was unknown in the way a closed door is unknown when no one has yet decided whether it should be opened. In some early cartographic traditions, blank spaces were not always considered empty in a negative sense. Sometimes they were placeholders. Sometimes they were warnings. Sometimes they were simply acknowledgments that information had not arrived yet. And when you look at older world maps with that in mind, Antarctica becomes less of a hidden continent and more of a slowly forming idea, of a thought the world was still having. Modern interpretations often try to compress that slow formation into something more immediate. That is where speculation begins to grow. People notice differences between historical sketches and modern satellite images and start asking whether something was removed or adjusted or forgotten. These questions appear frequently in discussions about unexplained phenomena and hidden historical records. But when you step back, away from interpretation, and just stay with the timeline of exploration itself, a different picture emerges. Early sightings of Antarctic land were fragmented. Expeditions approached the continent from different directions, at different times, under different conditions. Ice conditions shift visibility. Weather can obscure entire coastlines. What one crew recorded as land, another might not have been able to approach at all. Even today, satellite imaging has only recently given us a stable and consistent view of the entire continent. So the idea that older maps show inconsistencies is not surprising in itself. What becomes interesting is how those inconsistencies are emotionally interpreted. Because humans rarely respond to uncertainty with neutrality, we tend to fill gaps with narrative. And Antarctica, being one of the largest physical gaps in human experience for so long, naturally attracted more narrative than most places. In the calm world of sleep-focused storytelling, this becomes something different. It is no longer about proving or disproving anything. It becomes about observing how the mind behaves when faced with incomplete information. You might notice how easily the idea of lost Antarctic maps appears in conversation threads online. The phrase itself feels like it belongs to a forgotten archive, even though most of what is discussed under it is modern speculation. It is not that there were truly lost maps hidden away in a literal sense. It is that people feel there might have been versions of understanding that did not survive into the present. That feeling is powerful because it suggests that knowledge itself is not always stable. And if knowledge is not stable, then certainty becomes something we hold lightly. There is a quiet difference between saying this is unknown and saying this might have been known differently before. The second one feels more personal. It introduces time into uncertainty. It creates a sense that something shifted, even if we cannot see what it was. This is part of why Antarctica holds such a persistent place in modern conspiracy theories for sleep. It is not about dramatic hidden structures or sudden revelations. It is about a slow, almost peaceful doubt, the kind that doesn't disturb you immediately, but lingers at the edge of thought when everything else is quiet. And in that quiet, old maps feel different. Not like evidence, more like echoes. Echoes of attempts to understand a world that was too large, too distant, and too cold to be fully captured at once. As the early cartographers worked, they were not trying to create mystery. They were trying to reduce it. Every line they drew was an effort to make distance feel smaller. Every correction was an attempt to align imagination with observation. But the Antarctic region resisted that alignment for a very long time. Not because it was hiding, but because it was far. And distance in the age before modern travel was not just physical, it was informational. A place could be real and still remain abstract for generations. So when we think about the first lines ever drawn toward Antarctica on early maps, it may help to imagine them less as statements of fact and more as quiet negotiations between what was known and what was still waiting to be confirmed. And in that sense, those lines were never truly lost. They were simply provisional, waiting for the world to come closer. The room you are in right now might feel far from all of that, warm, still, familiar. And yet, somewhere in the background of human history, there were people tracing edges of a continent they would never fully see, hoping that what they drew would match what eventually arrived. And maybe it did. Or maybe it only came close enough for the world to keep refining it slowly over time. Either way, the maps remain. Quiet, slightly uncertain, and strangely calm when you look at them without rushing. Just lines drawn into ice that had not yet agreed to be known. There is something about early maps that makes people pause longer than they expect to. Not because they are beautiful, although they often are, but because they feel like they were made in a different relationship with truth. A relationship where uncertainty was not a problem to solve immediately, but something to sit alongside while continuing the work. When we continue thinking about Antarctica in this context, especially through the lens of lost Antarctic maps and older navigation charts, the conversation slowly shifts away from geography and begins to touch something more human. The limits of perception, the limits of communication, and the limits of how far information can travel before it becomes something slightly different on the other side. In the early centuries of global exploration, maps were not created in isolation. They were assembled, a piece from one sailor, a coastline sketch from another, a translated record from a merchant route, and sometimes even older sources that had already passed through multiple interpretations before reaching the cartographer's desk. This layering effect matters more than it seems at first, because every layer slightly changes the original signal. And over time, those small changes can begin to look like intentional design, even when they are simply the result of accumulation. This is one of the quiet reasons why Antarctica becomes such a frequent presence in conspiracy theories for sleep content online. Not because there is a single clear contradiction, but because there are many small gaps that feel meaningful when viewed together. The mind does this naturally. It connects incomplete points into continuous lines. And once those lines exist, they feel like they must have been drawn that way for a reason. There's a recurring example often mentioned in discussions about historical cartography, the Piri Reis map. It is a fragmentary Ottoman world map from the early 1500s, drawn on parchment, showing parts of Europe, Africa, and South America with surprising detail for its time. Some interpretations of the map suggest that it may include distant southern land hints that resemble Antarctica in abstract form. Historians generally explain this through a combination of source material, projection distortion, and the limitations of early geographic knowledge. The southern edges of world maps at that time were often speculative, influenced by older ideas about a balanced world or unknown southern continents that were theorized long before they were confirmed. But what makes the Peary Rise map so frequently discussed is not necessarily what it shows, but what people think they see when they look at it without context. And that is an important distinction. Because maps do not only show geography, they also show interpretation. When you remove interpretation, what remains is often less dramatic, but more precise. And yet, human attention is naturally drawn to the moments where interpretation and data do not fully align. This is where Antarctica becomes almost symbolic. A place that was not fully mapped until relatively recently in human history, appearing on early world maps in incomplete or theoretical forms, becomes an easy canvas for questions that do not have immediate answers. And so the idea of lost Antarctic maps grows not necessarily from missing evidence, but from the emotional space between certainty and uncertainty. There is also something important to understand about how Antarctica itself was gradually revealed. Unlike continents that were explored and settled in overlapping waves, Antarctica resisted entry for a long time. Even when sightings were made, conditions often made it impossible to confirm what was seen. Ice barriers, shifting weather, and extreme cold created a kind of natural delay in human understanding. So for centuries, Antarctica was not just unknown. It was intermittently visible. Well, that matters, because intermittent visibility creates fragmented records. And fragmented records naturally produce inconsistent maps. Modern satellite systems have now removed much of that uncertainty. We can see Antarctica continuously, in detail, across seasons. But when people look back at older charts, they are not comparing them to modern accuracy. They are comparing them to modern expectation of consistency. And those are not the same thing. This is one of the subtle misunderstandings that often appears in online discussions about unexplained phenomena and historical mapping anomalies. The assumption is that inconsistency implies concealment, but in historical context, inconsistency often simply reflects limitation. Still, the emotional pull of the idea remains strong. Because the mind is not only interested in what is correct, it is also interested in what feels unresolved. In quieter spaces, especially in content designed for sleep, these unresolved ideas take on a different tone. They become less like puzzles and more like drifting thoughts. You are not expected to solve them. You are only invited to notice them. Antarctica, in this sense, becomes less of a location and more of a mental environment. A blank space at the bottom of the world where imagination can rest without being forced into action. There is also a historical aspect that often gets overlooked in simplified discussions. Early mapmakers were deeply aware of their limitations. Many of them included warnings, notes, or symbolic markers indicating uncertain regions. Some even used phrases that translated loosely into "beyond here, we do not know." These were not secrets. They were acknowledgments. And they tell us something important about how knowledge was treated at the time. It was honest about its edges. Over time, as mapping became more precise, those edges became less visible. not because uncertainty disappeared, but because it was gradually replaced by measured data. However, the older sense of visible uncertainty remains preserved in historical charts, and when those charts are viewed today, outside of their original context, they can feel strangely suggestive, as if they are pointing toward something hidden rather than something unfinished. This is where interpretation begins to drift. And once interpretation drifts, narratives begin to form. Some of those narratives eventually connect Antarctica to ideas of hidden expeditions, unusual discoveries, or government secrecy. In reality, most Antarctic exploration is well documented, particularly in the modern era under international treaties and scientific cooperation. Research stations from multiple countries operate openly across the continent, focusing on climate science, glaciology, and atmospheric studies. But even documented openness does not always remove speculation. Because speculation is not always about evidence. Sometimes it is about scale. Antarctica is large enough, remote enough, and environmentally extreme enough that it naturally feels outside ordinary experience. And anything outside ordinary experience tends to attract additional layers of meaning in human storytelling. That is why even scientific topics like atmospheric research or climate monitoring in polar regions sometimes appear in conspiracy discussions. Not because the science is hidden, but because it is complex, and complexity often feels indistinguishable from mystery when explained without familiarity. So the idea of weather control theories, or atmospheric manipulation, occasionally appears in online spaces, usually disconnected from the actual scientific work being done. Real atmospheric research focuses on understanding systems, not controlling them. But in sleep-focused narration, what matters more is not correcting every misconception, but observing how easily complexity transforms into narrative when viewed from a distance. And Antarctica, again, becomes a perfect stage for that transformation. Because it is distant, quiet, and mostly unseen in everyday life. There is also a psychological layer worth noticing. When people encounter incomplete historical information, especially about remote places, the mind tends to fill gaps in ways that feel coherent. This is not unusual. It is how humans process uncertainty. But when those gaps are large enough, the resulting narratives can become highly elaborate. Lost maps, hidden routes, altered records. These ideas often grow in the spaces where information is sparse and curiosity is high. But if you slow down those thoughts, something else becomes visible. Not conspiracy, not confirmation, just the structure of how the mind organizes unknowns. That creates continuity, even when continuity does not exist. And perhaps that is the quiet truth behind many of these Antarctic mapping discussions. Not that something was deliberately hidden, but that incomplete knowledge naturally invites completion in the mind of the observer. When you return to the physical maps themselves, the older ones, the parchment lines, the early sketches of southern oceans, there is a kind of calmness in them. They do not argue. They do not insist. They simply show what was understood at the time and where understanding had not yet reached. In that sense, they are honest in a way that modern interpretations sometimes overlook. They are not claiming to know everything. They are showing the edge of knowing. And Antarctica sits exactly at that edge. Even today, when fully mapped, fully studied, and continuously monitored, it retains that symbolic position, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder of how long it takes for distant parts of the world to become fully integrated into human understanding. So when people talk about lost Antarctic maps or older charts that seem different or unexplained variations in early geography, it may help to think of them not as missing pieces of a hidden puzzle, but as snapshots taken at different distances from the same object. Some closer, some farther. It's all limited by their moment in time. And as the world moved closer, the image became clearer. Not because anything was removed, but because perspective changed. And as you listen to that idea slowly, without needing to hold onto it too tightly, it becomes easier to let the thought drift rather than resolve it. Because not every question is asking for an answer. Some are just asking to be noticed long enough before sleep takes over the rest. After the first confirmed journeys toward Antarctica, something changed in the way the world looked at its own maps. Not immediately, not in a dramatic way, it was quieter than that. Almost like a correction that happens so gradually, you only notice it years later when you compare two versions of the same thought. The blank space at the bottom of old world maps began to shrink, slowly at first, then more confidently. Expeditions returned with colder stories, sharper observations, and a growing sense that the southernmost region of the planet was not a mystery anymore, but a reality that resisted simplicity. And yet, even as Antarctica became known, something unusual happened. The silence around it did not disappear. It only changed shape. In the early 19th and 20th centuries, exploration into Antarctica intensified. Ships pushed further into ice-heavy waters. Coastal outlines began to be recorded with more consistency. Scientific curiosity replaced earlier theoretical speculation. On paper, it looked like closure, a blank space finally being filled in. But in practice, Antarctica remained distant in a way that was difficult to normalize. Even when coordinates were recorded, even when landing points were established, the continent itself did not behave like other landmasses in the human imagination. It did not open up in layers like Europe or Asia had done through centuries of gradual cultural exchange. Instead, it stayed physically separate, climatically extreme, logistically difficult, emotionally remote. That distance mattered more than most records show. Because distance, when it cannot be crossed easily, creates space for interpretation. And interpretation is where silence begins to take on meaning. In the years after Antarctica was officially mapped in broader outlines, something subtle appeared in historical discussion and later in modern conspiracy theories for sleep content. The idea that the story of Antarctica was somehow finished too quickly in public understanding, not in academic circles, but in popular imagination. One moment it was unknowns. Then it was known. And for some people, that transition felt too clean. But if you look at the actual progression of exploration, it was anything but clean. The early 20th century brought repeated expeditions from multiple nations. Each one added fragments of detail, but none of them produced a complete picture in a single moment. Ice shelves shifted, weather obscured visibility, routes changed depending on season and survival conditions. Even defining a coastline in Antarctica was not as simple as drawing a line where land ended and sea began, because ice itself complicates that boundary. What looks stable on modern satellite images was once a constantly shifting negotiation between temperature, pressure, and time. This is where the silence begins to make more sense. It was not absence of information. It was accumulation without coherence. A continent that was being recorded in pieces across years by different teams, under conditions that rarely repeated themselves in the same way twice. And when information accumulates like that, it does not always produce clarity immediately. Sometimes it produces a long period where everything is technically known, but not fully understood as a single whole. That is a different kind of silence. Not emptiness, but incompletion. In that incompletion, Antarctica began to take on a very specific role in modern imagination. It became a place where unknowns could safely exist without needing immediate resolution. In scientific communities, it was a place of ongoing research. In geopolitical discussions, it was governed by treaties emphasizing cooperation and neutrality. But in informal online spaces, especially in discussions around unexplained phenomena and government secrecy narratives, it became something else entirely. A symbolic blank. A space where questions could gather without pressure to settle. And when people talk about conspiracy theories for sleep involving Antarctica, they are often not reacting to a single claim. They are reacting to this broader feeling of incompletion that the continent still carries in cultural memory. Even now, when we know so much more than early explorers could have imagined, Antarctica still feels slightly outside of everyday reach. Most people will never see it directly. They experience it through images, documentaries, or second-hand descriptions. That indirect experience preserves a certain distance, even in the modern world. And distance has a way of keeping imagination active. One of the recurring themes in post-discovery Antarctic discussion is the contrast between official scientific presence and perceived emptiness. The reality is that Antarctica hosts numerous research stations from different countries. These stations operate continuously, studying climate patterns, ice cores, atmospheric chemistry, and polar ecosystems. Data collected there is central to understanding global climate systems. But despite this constant scientific presence, the continent still feels quiet in public perception. Part of that comes from how information is shared. Scientific data is precise, but not always emotionally accessible. It describes systems, not stories. And when something is described in systems rather than narrative, the mind sometimes fills in the narrative on its own. This is where weather control theories, atmospheric research speculation, and other loosely connected ideas occasionally appear in online spaces, not because the science suggests them, but because the scale of the research itself can feel abstract when viewed without context. Large climate models, polar atmospheric measurements, long-term ice sheet analysis. These are deeply real scientific fields, but they operate on timescales and datasets that are far removed from everyday experience. And when something feels far removed, it can begin to feel undefined, even when it is well documented. This gap between documentation and emotional understanding is one of the quiet drivers behind many modern conspiracy discussions, especially those designed for sleep, where the goal is not to provoke urgency, but to sit gently within ambiguity. Antarctica fits into that space almost naturally. After discovery, the continent did not become fully integrated into human narrative in the same way other regions did. There are no cities, no permanent civilian populations, no familiar cultural anchors. It is present in global systems, but absent from daily life. That creates a strange duality. Known but not experienced. Mapped but not inhabited, studied but not visited. And dualities like that tend to generate reflective thinking. In the decades following major Antarctic exploration efforts, particularly during the mid-20th century, documentation became more structured. International agreements were formed. Scientific collaboration increased. The Antarctic Treaty System established guidelines for peaceful research and environmental protection, reinforcing the idea that the continent was not a site of territorial competition, but of shared scientific interest. On paper, this should have reduced mystery. But instead, it changed its form. Because when something becomes stable in official structure, the imagination often moves to its edges, to what is not emphasized, to what is not personally witnessed. This is one reason why older expeditions, like those led during the early post-war period, continue to appear in discussions about unexplained phenomena. Not necessarily because the records are unclear, but because large-scale exploration in remote regions naturally invites narrative layering over time. Stories attach themselves to silence. And Antarctica has always had a particular kind of silence. Even now, if you look at satellite imagery, the continent appears visually simple at first glance. White expanses, ice shelves, coastal outlines shaped by freezing and melting cycles. But that visual simplicity hides immense complexity in motion, temperature variation, and geological depth beneath the ice. So what appears quiet is actually dynamic. But the human mind often interprets quiet as stillness, and stillness as meaning. That interpretation is where modern myth-making begins to form, not as deliberate fabrication, but as an attempt to give structure to something that feels too large to hold in a single thought. In sleep-focused storytelling, this is where Antarctica becomes especially interesting, because it does not demand resolution. It allows drift. You can think about it without needing to conclude anything about it. You can hold the idea of lost Antarctic maps or shifting historical depictions, or early exploration uncertainty, without turning it into a fixed belief. It exists more like background atmosphere than argument. And in that atmosphere, the mind often relaxes. There is also something important about the way historical silence behaves differently from modern silence. Modern silence is usually intentional. You close a door, you mute a device, you step away from noise. Historical silence is different. It is the result of limited access, limited recording, and limited transmission of information across distance and time. So when we look back at Antarctica's early post-discovery period, the silence we perceive is not absence of activity. It is absence of continuous shared visibility. Expeditions were happening, data was being collected, observations were being recorded, but they were distributed across time, across nations, across formats that did not immediately merge into a unified public understanding. That delay created space, and in that space, interpretation grew. Over time, modern viewers compress that entire period into a simplified mental image. Antarctica discovered, then mapped, then understood. But the reality is more gradual, more fragmented, and in some ways more human. Because understanding rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates. Like ice layers forming year after year, each one preserving a slightly different version of the atmosphere that created it. And if you think about Antarctica in that way, not as a single discovered object, but as a long unfolding record of human attention, then the silence after discovery does not feel like emptiness anymore. It feels like transition, a slow shift from guessing to measuring, from imagining to observing, from distant speculation to structured study. And yet, even with all of that, a part of the human mind still returns to the earlier phase occasionally, not because it rejects what is known, but because it remembers what it felt like not to know. That feeling never fully disappears. It just becomes quieter over time. Like wind moving over ice fields long after the storm has passed. And in that quiet, Antarctica remains what it has always been in human thought. Not fully mysterious, not fully familiar, but suspended somewhere between the two, where maps once hesitated, and where imagination still sometimes returns when everything else becomes still. When the official outlines of Antarctica began to stabilize on modern maps, it created an impression that the unknown had finally been placed under control. But control is not the same thing as completion. And completion is not the same thing as understanding. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, Antarctica was no longer a blank space on the map. It had coastlines, coordinates, expedition routes, and increasingly detailed scientific surveys. Yet even in this more structured phase, something subtle remained unresolved in public imagination. Not in the data itself, but in how the data felt. There is a difference between a place being mapped and a place being mentally integrated. Antarctica was mapped. but it never fully softened into familiarity. And that gap is where many modern interpretations of unexplained phenomena begin to form, especially in online spaces where conspiracy theories for sleep are shared as slow, atmospheric narratives rather than arguments. One of the most important things to understand about this period is how fragmented the information still was, even after official discovery had long passed. Expeditions from different nations collected vast amounts of data, but it was not always centralized immediately. Some reports were published quickly, others took years to circulate, and some remained in technical archives that were not widely read outside scientific communities. So while the world had a general picture of Antarctica, the details were still being assembled for a long time afterward. This creates a subtle but important psychological effect. A place can be known in outline while still being unknown in detail. And when that happens, the mind often fills the missing detail with narrative rather than data. This is where many of the quieter Antarctic-related conspiracy discussions originate online, not from a single event or document, but from the slow accumulation of partial visibility. For example, when people revisit early 20th century expedition records, they sometimes notice differences in how routes were described, or how certain regions were mapped with varying precision depending on weather conditions and available technology. These inconsistencies are not unusual in exploration history, especially in extreme environments, but they can feel suggestive when removed from their original context. Because context matters more than appearance. The line on a map is not just geography, it is also a record of difficulty, timing, and human limitation. As mapping technology improved, especially with aerial surveys and later satellite imaging, many of these inconsistencies were resolved. Coastlines became more precise. Ice coverage could be tracked seasonally. The continent slowly transformed from fragmented observation into continuous measurement. But even then, something did not fully settle in public perception. Antarctica remained emotionally distant. And emotional distance is not easily corrected by technical accuracy. This is one reason why the idea of hidden Antarctic stations or undisclosed research activity occasionally appears in modern online discussions, even though Antarctica is one of the most internationally monitored scientific regions on Earth. Research stations are openly documented, and scientific work is shared through global networks. Yet the perception of secrecy persists in some spaces. Not because secrecy is present in the data, but because remoteness can feel like concealment when it is experienced indirectly. When you cannot easily visit a place, when you cannot easily verify it with your own senses, when your understanding comes through layers of reporting and imagery. The mind sometimes translates distance into uncertainty, and uncertainty into speculation. This is not unique to Antarctica. It happens with deep oceans, outer space, and even complex scientific systems like climate modeling and atmospheric research. In each case, the scale of the subject exceeds everyday experience, and so the imagination begins to simplify or reframe it into more familiar patterns. That is where terms like weather control theories sometimes enter conversations online, not as reflections of actual atmospheric science, but as attempts to interpret complex systems through more accessible narratives. Real atmospheric research in polar regions focuses on understanding long-term climate behavior, ice dynamics, and atmospheric chemistry. It is methodical, data-driven, and collaborative across multiple countries. But method and perception do not always align, especially when the subject is large enough to feel abstract. Antarctica's scale plays a quiet role in all of this. It is not just a continent. It is a system of ice sheets, seasonal changes, ocean interactions, and atmospheric connections that influence global climate patterns. That complexity makes it scientifically important, but emotionally distant. And emotional distance often becomes narrative space. In sleep-focused storytelling, that narrative space is not treated as something to resolve, but something to gently observe. The goal is not to close the gap between fact and speculation, but to let the mind rest within the presence of both without tension. There is also something worth noticing about how Antarctica is represented in historical memory versus modern visualization. Older representations were incomplete, often uncertain, and openly provisional. Modern representations are precise, continuous, and data-rich. But paradoxically, the older maps sometimes feel more intriguing to people, not because they are more accurate, but because they visibly show uncertainty. They do not hide the limits of knowledge. They display them. Modern maps, in contrast, give the impression of completeness. Even though they are still models, still subject to updates and refinements, they appear final to the casual viewer. And when something appears final, the mind tends to assume the story is closed. But Antarctica does not behave like a closed story in human imagination. It behaves more like a background process, always present, rarely visited, constantly measured, rarely felt directly. This creates a dual perception, scientifically integrated, yet psychologically distant. And in that duality, narratives naturally emerge to bridge the gap. Some of those narratives take the form of historical reinterpretations, where older expeditions are re-examined for hidden meaning. Others take the form of speculative connections between different eras of exploration. But when examined carefully, most of these interpretations tend to reflect the same underlying pattern: a discomfort with incomplete visibility. Because humans are not only recorders of information, we are also interpreters of absence. And absence is rarely neutral. It tends to feel like something waiting to be filled. In Antarctica's case, that filling often happens through imagination rather than evidence, especially in online spaces where slow, atmospheric storytelling blends historical facts with reflective speculation. This is where conspiracy theories for sleep content often live, not in claims of certainty, but in gentle exploration of uncertainty itself. Not "this is what happened," but "this is what might feel like it could have been missing." And that distinction matters, because it keeps the narrative in a space where it does not demand belief. Only attention. If you look back at the decades after Antarctica's major exploration era, one of the most consistent themes is increasing precision. Weather stations became more reliable. Ice measurements became more consistent. Satellite imaging removed much of the ambiguity that earlier explorers had to navigate physically. But precision does not automatically produce familiarity. You can measure something completely and still feel distant from it. And Antarctica remains one of the clearest examples of that. Fully measured, partially experienced, known through systems, not through everyday life. So when people encounter older maps or historical sketches or fragmented expedition records, they are not necessarily seeing evidence of something hidden. They are often seeing snapshots from different stages of the same long process of understanding. Some early, some intermediate, some modern, all reflecting the limits of their time. And when those snapshots are viewed without context, the differences between them can feel more meaningful than they actually are. But meaning is not always the same as fact. Sometimes it is just the mind noticing variation and trying to turn it into continuity. As this chapter of Antarctica's post-discovery history settles into modern understanding, what remains is not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a record of gradual clarification. A continent moving from theoretical presence to mapped reality. From distant concept to scientific observation. From fragmented sightings to continuous monitoring. And yet, even with all of that, it still occupies a quiet symbolic space in human thought. Not because it is unknown, but because it is far enough away from everyday life that it still feels slightly outside the rhythm of normal experience. And that slight distance is enough for imagination to continue working gently in the background. Not as certainty, not as claim, but as a soft continuation of curiosity that never fully turns off, even when the facts are already in place. And in that way, Antarctica remains unchanged in one important sense. It is still a place where the world once hesitated, even if it no longer needs to. There are moments in history when a place stops being unknown, but never fully stops feeling unknown. Antarctica is one of those places. By the mid-20th century, it had already been mapped, visited, and repeatedly studied through international expeditions. The outlines were no longer speculative. The coordinates were no longer theoretical. And yet, something about that continent continued to generate questions in quieter corners of public thought. Not loud questions, more like slow ones. The kind that appear late at night when everything else has already gone quiet. One of the most frequently mentioned historical reference points in these discussions is Operation Highjump, a large United States Navy expedition to Antarctica conducted in 1946-1947. It was not a hidden mission. It was documented, announced, and widely acknowledged as a major post-war exploration effort. The official goals were practical and scientific in nature, focusing on training, mapping, and establishing a stronger operational presence in polar conditions. But large-scale operations in extreme environments rarely stay emotionally simple in public imagination, even when the records are clear. Because scale itself can feel suggestive when it is far removed from everyday experience. A fleet of ships moving through ice-heavy waters, aircraft conducting aerial surveys over vast white terrain, teams operating in conditions that most people will never directly encounter. All of this is real, documented, and historically verified. And yet, for some observers decades later, the very size of the operation becomes part of the mystery. Not because something unusual is proven to have happened, but because large, complex efforts often leave gaps in personal understanding. And those gaps can be filled in different ways depending on perspective. In sleep-focused storytelling, especially in conspiracy theories for sleep-style content, Operation Highjump is often mentioned not as a claim, but as an atmosphere, a moment in history where human activity reached into one of the most remote environments on Earth at a scale that still feels slightly abstract when described in passing. It is important to stay close to what is actually known here. The mission was led by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byard, a well-documented polar explorer with earlier Antarctic experience. The operation included thousands of personnel and multiple ships. Its duration was relatively short, and its publicly stated objectives were related to training, exploration, and establishing American capability in polar regions after World War II. There is no verified evidence of hidden discoveries or secret encounters associated with the operation in official records. But that has not stopped interpretation from forming around it. An interpretation is where history begins to drift into narrative. One of the reasons Operation Highjump continues to appear in modern online discussions is not because the facts are unclear, but because the environment in which it took place is inherently difficult to visualize. Antarctica is not like other historical theaters of exploration. There are no cities in the traditional sense, no long-term civilian settlements from that era, no familiar geographic reference points that most people can relate to directly. It is a landscape defined by absence of usual markers. And when a setting lacks familiar structure, the mind often builds its own structure around the events that occurred there. That is where speculative layers begin to form. Some modern interpretations connect Highjump to ideas of unexplained activity or concealed outcomes. These interpretations often circulate without primary source grounding, and they tend to grow through repetition rather than documentation. In most cases, they are not rooted in archival evidence, but in later reinterpretations of what large military expeditions might imply when placed in an unfamiliar environment. But if you return to the actual historical context, something much more grounded appears. Post-war geopolitics. Rapid technological development in aviation and navigation. Early efforts to understand polar conditions more systematically. and a growing recognition that Antarctica was not just a distant landmass, but a region with strategic, scientific, and environmental importance. In other words, what looks mysterious from a distance often becomes practical when viewed in detail. Still, the emotional layer remains separate from the factual layer. And that separation is important to notice, especially in content designed for calm listening and sleep. Because the goal here is not to resolve every question. It is to understand why the questions appear in the first place. When people encounter Operation Highjump in modern discussions about unexplained phenomena, what they are often responding to is not the operation itself, but the scale of human movement in a place that feels inherently isolated. Ships in ice. Aircraft over white horizons. Teams operating in conditions that are difficult to imagine physically. That imagery alone is enough to generate a sense of distance from ordinary reality. And distance, again, becomes the space where speculation can grow. Another layer that sometimes appears in these discussions involves Rear Admiral Richard E. Byatt himself. His documented expeditions before and after Highjump are well recorded in historical archives. He was a prominent figure in polar exploration, and his contributions to mapping and surveying Antarctica are part of established history. However, over time, fragments of alleged diaries, paraphrased stories, and unverified accounts began circulating online that attribute extraordinary or fictional elements to his experiences. These do not match verified historical records, and they are widely considered unreliable by researchers. Yet they continue to appear in online spaces, often detached from their original context. This is not unusual in digital culture. Historical figures often become anchors for evolving narratives, especially when they are associated with remote or extreme environments. The less familiar the environment, the easier it becomes for additional layers to attach themselves to the person connected to it. But when we return to verified history, the picture remains consistent. A structured expedition, documented objectives, measurable outcomes, and no credible evidence of the more dramatic interpretations that later developed in speculative spaces. Still, even after separating fact from reinterpretation, something remains worth observing. Not as evidence, but as behavior. Why do these narratives continue to attach themselves to Antarctic exploration in particular? Part of the answer lies in how human attention responds to isolation. Antarctica is not just geographically remote, it is experientially remote. Very few people have direct, personal reference points for it. Most understanding comes through mediated sources, reports, documentaries, scientific publications, or curated imagery. This indirect relationship creates a subtle psychological distance. And when direct experience is limited, imagination becomes more active in filling the gaps. This is where broader themes like unexplained phenomena, hidden research narratives, or atmospheric research speculation sometimes emerge in online storytelling. not necessarily because they are supported by evidence, but because the environment itself feels abstract enough to host them. Even real scientific work in Antarctica, such as climate modeling, ice core analysis, and atmospheric monitoring, can feel unfamiliar when described without context. These fields operate on large datasets, long timelines, and global implications. That scale can feel detached from everyday life, which sometimes leads to misinterpretation in informal discussions. But within scientific communities, the work is straightforward. Data is collected. The patterns are analyzed. The systems are modeled. And results are shared internationally. There is nothing hidden in the structure of that process. Yet perception does not always follow structure. Perception follows familiarity. And Antarctica remains outside most people's direct familiarity. So Operation Highjump becomes more than just a historical expedition in public imagination. It becomes a reference point where real history, environmental extremity, and narrative speculation occasionally overlap. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the setting is so distant that it invites reinterpretation. In sleep-focused narration, it is important to stay gentle with that overlap, not to sharpen it into certainty, but to let it exist as background thought. Something you can observe without needing to conclude. Because when you remove the pressure to decide what something means, the mind often relaxes naturally. And Antarctica, in this context, becomes less about hidden answers and more about the experience of distance itself. A place where humans went. A place humans studied. A place humans still monitor constantly. And yet a place that remains slightly removed from everyday emotional geography. Even now, even after all the maps, even after all the data, and maybe that is why it continues to appear in these late-night narratives. Not as a puzzle to solve, but as a reminder of how large the world still feels when you stop trying to compress it into certainty. When you continue looking at Operation Highjump beyond the headlines and simplified summaries, what becomes more noticeable is not what was hidden, but what was openly difficult. Antarctica does not allow easy movement. Even today, it resists simple travel, simple logistics, and simple visibility. In 1946-1947, that difficulty was far more pronounced. The technology existed to attempt large-scale operations, but not to make them feel effortless. So what the expedition actually represents, when stripped of later interpretation, is something much more grounded. A transition moment. A period when human capability was expanding faster than human familiarity with extreme environments. Aircraft were becoming more capable of long-range flight, but polar navigation was still unpredictable. Ice conditions could change routes without warning. Weather systems in Antarctic regions could reduce visibility to near zero within moments. Communication systems were improving, but still limited by the standards we take for granted today. So even a well-organized mission like high jump existed inside a constant negotiation with uncertainty. Not mystery, uncertainty. And that difference matters more than it first appears. Mystery suggests hidden meaning. Uncertainty simply describes incomplete control over conditions. But when viewed from far away in time, those two can start to look similar. This is one of the subtle reasons Operation High Jump continues to surface in discussions about unexplained phenomena and Antarctic speculation. Not because the historical record indicates anything unusual, but because the environment in which it occurred is inherently hard to reconstruct emotionally. You can read reports. You can see photographs. You can study maps and logs. But it is still difficult to feel what it was like to move through that landscape in that era of technology. And when emotional reconstruction is incomplete, imagination tends to fill the remaining space. In modern conspiracy theories for sleep-style content, this often becomes a quiet narrative layer rather than a bold claim. The idea is not necessarily that something extraordinary happened, but that something large and unfamiliar took place in a place most people cannot easily picture. That alone is enough to generate lingering curiosity. One of the more persistent interpretive patterns that developed over time involves the figure of Admiral Richard E. Byard. In verified historical accounts, Byard is recognized as a significant polar explorer with multiple Antarctic expeditions spanning decades. His contributions to mapping, aviation-based surveying, and logistical understanding of polar environments are well documented. However, over time, paraphrased and fictionalized accounts began circulating that attribute statements or experiences to him that are not supported by primary sources. These narratives often appear in fragmented forms, detached from archival context, and are repeated in various online spaces without verification. This is a common pattern in historical reinterpretation. A real figure, a real expedition, followed by layers of later storytelling that gradually drift away from the original material. It is important to separate these layers clearly, because once they merge in perception, it becomes difficult to distinguish documented history from later narrative expansion. In the case of Operation High Jump, the documented record remains consistent. A large-scale naval operation focused on Antarctic exploration, training, and environmental familiarity in extreme conditions. There are no credible official records indicating concealed findings or extraordinary events beyond the scope of exploration challenges. But again, the absence of extraordinary records does not prevent extraordinary interpretations from forming in later discussions, especially in environments where the subject itself feels distant from everyday life. Antarctica has that effect more than most regions. It is not integrated into daily human experience in the same way continents with dense populations are. There are no cities to mentally anchor it, no cultural familiarity that grows through repeated exposure in ordinary life. Instead, it exists in a more abstract layer of awareness. You know it is there. You know it is studied. You know expeditions go there. But you rarely experience it directly. And that creates a kind of cognitive separation. When something is known but not experienced, it can feel both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. This duality is one of the key reasons Antarctic-related narratives often drift into themes like unexplained phenomena or atmospheric research speculation in online discussions, not because the scientific work itself suggests hidden meanings, but because the scale of the environment is hard to translate into everyday intuition. Even real topics like polar atmospheric research, ice sheet dynamics, and climate modeling can feel abstract when described without grounding context. These fields involve long-term data sets, global system interactions, and complex environmental feedback loops. They are precise, but not always intuitively accessible. And when something is precise but not intuitively accessible, perception can sometimes separate from understanding. That separation is where informal narratives begin to form. Not as deliberate misinformation, but as attempts to emotionally interpret large-scale systems. In sleep-oriented storytelling, this becomes especially noticeable. The narration does not need to resolve those interpretations. Instead, it allows them to remain in a softened state where they are present but not demanding attention. This is why Antarctica works so naturally in this format. It holds information and distance at the same time. And distance, when held gently, tends to become calming rather than unsettling. Returning to Operation Highjump, what remains most stable in historical understanding is its role in a broader shift of human engagement with extreme environments. It was part of a post-war period where technological capability was expanding rapidly, and nations were increasingly interested in understanding remote regions for scientific and strategic reasons. Antarctica, in that sense, was not a mystery being solved. It was a frontier being approached with new tools. And like any frontier, it revealed both capability and limitation at the same time. A capability in reaching it, limitation in fully mastering its conditions. That combination is often what creates lasting historical interest, not secrecy, but contrast. The contrast between human ambition and environmental resistance, between planned objectives and unpredictable reality, between structured mission goals and the uncontrolled nature of polar conditions. When those contrasts are viewed through modern hindsight, they can feel more dramatic than they originally were. Because hindsight removes the immediate difficulty and leaves only the outline of events. And outlines always feel simpler than lived experience. This is another reason why Operation Highjump continues to appear in speculative discussions. It has a clear structure in history, but an unclear emotional texture for those who were not there. And when emotional texture is missing, later interpretations tend to supply their own. But if you stay close to the documented record, the story remains consistent. A large expedition, a difficult environment, a rapidly advancing technological period, and a continent that still required far more study before it could be fully understood in detail. No hidden layer is required to explain it. Only context. And context, when fully present, often reduces the need for speculation rather than increasing it. Still, the persistence of these narratives tells us something important about how humans engage with remote environments. We are not only interested in what happened, we are also interested in what it felt like. And when feeling is incomplete, imagination steps in quietly to complete it. In Antarctica's case, that imagination often takes the form of slow, atmospheric interpretations of historical expeditions, scientific stations, and environmental extremes, not as assertions but as reflections of distance. And perhaps that is the most accurate way to hold it. Not as a mystery, not as a conclusion, but as a reminder that some parts of the world remain emotionally far away, even when they are physically mapped. And in that distance, thought naturally drifts, not toward answers, but toward quiets. There are maps that try to show the world as it is. And there are maps that, without meaning to, show how the world was understood at a particular moment in time. When you look at Antarctica through that lens, something subtle begins to shift. The conversation is no longer only about ice or exploration or even discovery. It becomes about comparison between versions of understanding, between older lines and newer ones, between what was drawn and what is now measured. By the time modern cartography reached high precision, Antarctica had already gone through several stages of representation. Early sketches, exploratory coastlines, partial surveys, aerial reconstructions, and finally satellite-based mapping all contributed to the version we recognize today. But these versions did not arrive all at once. They layered over time. And that layering is where perceived inconsistencies begin to appear. Not necessarily errors, but differences in method, access, and timing. In quiet online spaces where conspiracy theories for sleep are shared in a more reflective tone, these differences are often noticed first visually. Someone compares an older map to a modern satellite outline and sees variation in coastline detail, ice shelf boundaries, or the way certain regions are simplified. And the mind, naturally, tries to assign meaning to variation. But in cartography, variation is often a direct reflection of available tools. Early Antarctic mapping relied heavily on ship-based observation. Explorers recorded coastlines from limited vantage points, often under harsh weather conditions that reduced visibility. Ice conditions could block access entirely, forcing estimations rather than direct measurement. In some cases, entire stretches of coastline were inferred from indirect observation. This means that what was drawn was not always what was fully seen. It was what could be reasonably recorded at the time. Later aerial surveys changed that perspective significantly. Aircraft allowed broader coverage, reducing reliance on shipbound proximity. Suddenly, large sections of Antarctica could be observed in a single flight path. This improved accuracy, but still depended on weather conditions and timing. Then came satellite imaging. At that point, the continent stopped being assembled from fragments and became a continuously observable system. But even with this progression, older maps did not disappear. They remained in archives, academic references, and historical collections. And when placed side by side with modern images, they sometimes appear inconsistent in ways that feel more dramatic than they actually are. This is where interpretation begins to separate from methodology. Because a cartographic difference is not automatically a contradiction. It is often a record of progression. However, in modern discussions about unexplained phenomena and Antarctic mapping anomalies, these differences are sometimes framed in a more symbolic way, not necessarily as claims, but as questions. Why does one coastline look slightly different? Why does one region appear more extended in older depictions? Why do early maps sometimes include speculative southern landmass concepts? These questions are not new. They have existed in academic geography discussions for a long time. Many of them are explained through projection systems, incomplete surveying data, and historical theories about southern continents that predate confirmed Antarctic exploration. For example, the idea of a large southern landmass existed in pre-modern geography under theoretical constructs like Terra Australis. This was not based on Antarctic observation, but on philosophical and cartographic reasoning about balance in the world's land distribution. When Antarctica was later discovered, it was sometimes loosely associated with these older concepts in retrospective interpretation. But association is not the same as confirmation. And this distinction is important when revisiting older maps. Because what we see now is not just geography. It is the overlap of geography and historical imagination. As mapping techniques improved, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, the role of imagination gradually decreased, replaced by measurement and repeatable observation. However, earlier maps remained part of the historical record, not because they were accurate in a modern sense, but because they documented the evolution of understanding itself. In that sense, differences between maps are not anomalies. They are timestamps. Still, when these maps are viewed outside of historical context, especially in informal online discussions, they can feel like contradictions rather than progressions. And when contradiction is perceived, narrative interpretation often follows. This is where Antarctica becomes a frequent reference point in discussions about unexplained phenomena, government secrecy narratives, and atmospheric research speculation. Not because the cartographic record suggests hidden information, but because the visual contrast between eras can feel striking when stripped of explanatory context. A coastline that once looked approximate now appears precise. A blank region that once suggested possibility now appears fully defined. A theoretical outline becomes a measured boundary. To the analytical mind, this is expected progression. To the interpretive mind, it can feel like revision. And revision, when not understood through historical methodology, can sometimes be misread as alteration rather than improvement. This is a key point in understanding why lost Antarctic maps appear as a recurring phrase in modern conspiracy-adjacent discussions. The term itself suggests disappearance or suppression, but in most cases, what exists are simply older cartographic versions that have been superseded, not removed. They remain accessible in archives, libraries, and historical collections. They are not lost in a literal sense. They are just no longer current. But language has a way of shaping perception. An outdated map feels different from lost map. One suggests progression. The other suggests absence. And in slow, reflective storytelling environments, especially those designed for sleep, the second version often carries more emotional weight, even if it is less accurate. Because absence is easier to feel than progress. As we continue looking at Antarctic mapping differences, it becomes important to recognize how much of what we interpret comes from visual comparison without temporal context. When two maps from different eras are placed side by side, the brain naturally compares them, as if they were meant to represent the same moment in time. But they were not. They represent different stages of knowledge. And when knowledge evolves, its visual representation evolves with it. Even today, Antarctic mapping is not static. Ice sheets shift, seasonal changes alter visible boundaries. Glacial movement can gradually reshape coastline interpretations over long periods. Modern satellite systems account for these changes, but they still reflect a living system rather than a fixed shape. So even in the most precise era of cartography, Antarctica remains slightly dynamic. Not in a mysterious sense, but in a natural, environmental sense. That subtle movement keeps the continent from ever becoming completely visually static, even in modern data sets. And that is important to remember when revisiting older maps. Because what they captured was not a fixed object. It was a moment in a changing system. In sleep-focused narration, this understanding becomes less about correcting misconceptions and more about softening perception. Instead of seeing differences as conflicts, they can be held as variations in observation across time. Different tools, different conditions, different levels of access, and different intentions behind the recording process. When viewed this way, Antarctica does not appear as a place of contradiction. It appears as a place of evolving clarity. And that evolution is still ongoing. Even now, even in silence, even in the background of global systems that continue to monitor it continuously. So when people revisit older Antarctic maps and feel a sense of something missing, what they are often encountering is not hidden information. It is historical distance. The feeling of being far removed from the conditions under which those maps were made. And distance, again, changes perception more than detail ever can. In that sense, the maps are not misleading. They are simply far away from us in time. And when something is far enough away, it can begin to feel unfamiliar again, even if it has never changed. That is the quiet effect of time on understanding. Not loss, not concealment, but separation. And Antarctica, more than most places on Earth, carries that separation into every layer of its historical record. When you continue following the thread of Antarctic maps through time, something interesting becomes clearer. The differences people notice are not concentrated in one era, or one source, or one style of mapping. They are spread across centuries of gradual improvement, each step reducing uncertainty while revealing new detail that was previously inaccessible. But the human mind does not naturally process gradual improvement as a single continuous process. It breaks it into comparisons. Old versus new. Incomplete versus complete. Uncertain versus precise. And in that comparison, the older version often feels more emotionally charged, even if it is objectively less accurate. This is especially noticeable when looking at early Antarctic representations alongside modern satellite imagery. The older versions feel almost suggestive in their simplicity: large blank areas, soft coastline guesses, the sense that something is present but not fully defined. Modern maps, by contrast, feel firm, measured, stable. They give the impression that the question has been fully answered. But that impression is stronger than the reality. Because even today, Antarctic mapping is not a frozen, unchanging artifact. It is continuously refined. Ice movement, seasonal variation, and updated measurement techniques still adjust the details over time. The continent is mapped with high precision, but that precision is always being maintained rather than finalized. This creates a subtle but important distinction. Antarctica is not a completed image. It is an ongoing record. And when you understand that, the differences between older and newer maps begin to look less like contradictions and more like stages in a long observational process. Still, in informal online discussions, especially those centered around unexplained phenomena or atmospheric research speculation, these differences are often interpreted in more symbolic ways, not as evidence of hidden changes, but as signals that something does not fully align at first glance. For example, slight variations in coastline detail between historical charts and modern datasets are sometimes highlighted as unusual. In reality, these variations often come from the limitations of early observation methods. Ship-based mapping could only record what was visible from certain distances and angles. Ice conditions could obscure entire sections of land. And in many cases, the coastline being drawn was an interpretation of intermittent visibility rather than continuous observation. When aircraft surveying became more common, the perspective widened significantly. Entire regions could be photographed and analyzed from above, reducing reliance on fragmented shoreline sightings. This improved consistency, but still depended on weather conditions and timing of flights. Then satellite technology introduced a new level of continuity. But each stage did not erase the previous one. It replaced it in terms of accuracy, but preserved it in historical record. So when people encounter older Antarctic maps today, they are not looking at incorrect information in the sense of being deliberately misleading. They are looking at snapshots of understanding taken at different technological moments. And snapshots, by their nature, do not always align perfectly when compared without context. This is where the idea of lost Antarctic maps continues to appear in modern discourse. The phrase itself suggests disappearance, but in most documented cases, the maps in question still exist in archives, libraries, and historical collections. They are simply no longer the most accurate representation of current geographic knowledge. What has changed is not their existence. It is their relevance. But relevance is not always how the mind interprets visual difference. When something looks different enough, especially across time periods, it can feel like something has been altered rather than updated. This is one of the subtle cognitive patterns behind many interpretations of historical cartography in online conspiracy discussions. Not a rejection of modern mapping science, but a response to visual discontinuity without temporal framing. Antarctica intensifies this effect because it is not a familiar environment. If a map of a well-known city changes slightly across decades, most people can contextualize it easily. Streets are added, buildings change, roads expand. There is a lived reference point that anchors understanding. But Antarctica does not offer that kind of personal anchoring for most viewers. So the comparison becomes abstract. And abstract comparison is more likely to generate interpretive narratives. This is where broader themes like unexplained phenomena or atmospheric research speculation sometimes enter the conversation, not because they are directly supported by cartographic evidence, but because the environment itself feels distant enough to hold multiple interpretations without immediate contradiction. Even real scientific topics associated with Antarctica, such as climate modeling, ice sheet dynamics, and atmospheric observation systems, can feel conceptually distant when presented without background context. These systems operate on global scales and long timelines, which makes them difficult to intuitively visualize. And when something is difficult to visualize, the mind often substitutes narrative structure for missing comprehension. That substitution is not unique to Antarctica. It appears in many areas of complex scientific understanding. But Antarctica is a particularly strong case because it combines remoteness, extreme environmental conditions, and limited direct human experience. So the emotional space around it remains open. Not empty, open. And open spaces in understanding tend to attract interpretation over time. When returning again to the question of map differences, one of the most grounded ways to understand them is to recognize that early cartographers were not working with false information. They were working with partial information. Partial visibility. Partial access. partial technological capability, and partial transmission of knowledge across explorers and time periods. Each map reflects the limits of its own moment, and those limits are visible only when compared to later precision. But precision itself is not the endpoint of understanding. It is simply a more refined stage of measurement. Even modern satellite-based Antarctic mapping continues to update as conditions change and new data becomes available. The continent is not static in measurement, even if it appears stable in representation. Ice flows. Temperatures fluctuate. Coastal boundaries shift subtly over time, and scientific models adjust accordingly. So in a way, the story of Antarctic maps is not a story of correction from wrong to right. It is a story of increasing resolution applied to a constantly changing system. That framing removes the need for dramatic reinterpretation. It replaces contradiction with continuity. And continuity is often less emotionally striking, but more accurate. In sleep-focused narration, this kind of perspective allows the mind to rest more easily within uncertainty. Instead of treating differences as something that must be resolved, they can be experienced as layers of observation stacked across time. Older maps do not disappear in this view. They simply belong to earlier viewpoints. Modern maps do not overwrite them. They refine them. And Antarctica itself remains the subject of that long refinement process, even now. Still observed, still measured, still slightly distant from everyday experience. And that distance is what allows these conversations to continue existing in reflective spaces online, where the goal is not to conclude, but to drift gently through ideas without pressure. Because in the end, the maps are not competing versions of truth. They are records of how truth was gradually approached. And Antarctica sits quietly in the center of that process. Not changing in essence, but changing in clarity. There is a point in every long historical story where facts stop feeling new and start feeling familiar. Antarctica reaches that point surprisingly early. Once the continent was mapped in a basic sense, attention did not disappear. It shifted from exploration to presence, from discovery to maintenance of knowledge. Research stations began appearing across different parts of the continent, operated by multiple countries under shared agreements. They were not hidden. They were documented, coordinated, and part of international scientific structure. But from a distance, they still feel abstract. Small points of human activity on an enormous white surface. That contrast alone is enough to keep Antarctica alive in modern conspiracy theories for sleep, not as evidence of anything hidden, but as a reminder of scale that is hard to emotionally process. Because scale changes perception more than detail ever can. And Antarctica is mostly scale. Wide distances, long silence, slow environmental change. Even the science conducted there reflects that pace. Ice cores are studied over thousands of years of climate history. Atmospheric measurements track patterns that move across global systems. Nothing there moves quickly in human terms. So even activity in Antarctica feels like stillness. And stillness, when stretched far enough, begins to feel like absence again. That is where imagination quietly steps in. Not to replace facts, but to fill emotional distance. And in that distance, Antarctica continues to sit, unchanged in reality, but constantly reinterpreted in thought. When people talk about hidden Antarctic stations or secret activity in remote regions, it usually sounds more dramatic than the reality it is trying to describe. But if you slow the idea down, remove the dramatic framing, what remains is something much simpler. Antarctica is difficult to access, difficult to stay in, and difficult to operate in. That alone creates distance in understanding. Not secrecy. Distance. The research stations that exist there are part of international agreements, shared across countries, and focused on climate science, geology, and atmospheric observation. They are documented and continuously monitored through scientific collaboration. But they are also physically isolated. And isolation changes perception. A place can be fully known in data and still feel unknown in experience. This is one of the quiet reasons Antarctica often appears in conspiracy theories for sleep-style content. Not because the facts suggest hidden structures or concealed operations, but because the environment itself does not translate easily into everyday mental reference. There are no cities to compare it to. There's no ordinary life happening in the background. Just controlled scientific presence surrounded by extreme conditions. And in that contrast, the mind tends to simplify the unknown into narrative shapes. Sometimes those shapes become ideas about hidden work or unexplained activity. But most of the time, they are just reflections of how large and empty the continent feels when imagined from afar. Even atmospheric research done in Antarctica, which is very real and well documented, can feel abstract when described without grounding context. Scientists study long-term climate patterns, ice movement, and atmospheric chemistry that connects to global systems. The work is precise, but it operates on scales that are not immediately intuitive. Years become data points. Ice becomes historical record. Air becomes measurable structure. And when everything is scaled that far out, it stops feeling like a place and starts feeling like a system. That shift is important because systems are harder to visualize than locations. And anything hard to visualize tends to attract interpretation. Not because something is missing, but because the mind prefers shapes it can hold easily. So Antarctica continues to appear in these slow, late-night discussions, not as a mystery to solve, but as a space where understanding stretches thin and becomes quiet. And in that quiet, thoughts drift more easily than they conclude. When you step away from maps and expeditions for a moment and look at Antarctica through the lens of science alone, the tone of the entire subject changes again. It becomes less about discovery and more about observation. The continent is not just ice sitting at the bottom of the world. It is part of a much larger atmospheric and oceanic system that affects global climate patterns in ways that are still being studied today. But even this scientific reality, when described in simple terms, can feel strangely distant. Because it operates on scales that are not human-scaled. Temperature shifts measured over decades. Ice layers formed over thousands of years. Air currents moving across entire hemispheres. In sleep-focused narration, this is where Antarctica quietly blends into themes of atmospheric research and large-scale environmental systems, not as something dramatic, but as something slow and continuous. Weather control theories sometimes appear in online discussions around topics like this, but the actual scientific work in Antarctica is far more grounded. It focuses on understanding how natural systems behave, not controlling them. Still, the existence of such theories tells us something important. When a system is large enough and complex enough, the human mind struggles to keep all its details in view at once. So it simplifies. Sometimes incorrectly, sometimes imaginatively, but almost always in an attempt to make something vast feel smaller and more understandable. Antarctica resists that simplification, not because it is hidden, but because it is interconnected with global systems that are themselves complex. So even basic scientific explanations can feel like they are pointing towards something larger than what can be easily pictured. And in that gap between explanation and visualization, quiet narratives often form. Not as claims, but as attempts to mentally structure something too large to fully hold at once. That is where Antarctica begins to feel less like a place and more like a slow-moving part of the Earth that is only partially visible to everyday awareness. One of the quiet realities of Antarctic science is that most of it is not visually dramatic. It is measurement. It is repetition. It is long-term tracking of systems that only make sense when seen across time. Ice cores, for example, are not just samples of frozen water. They are layered records of atmospheric conditions stretching back thousands of years. Each layer represents a moment in Earth's environmental history, preserved slowly, without interruption. But to someone hearing about it casually, it can sound almost abstract. Like reading time instead of watching it. This is where distance in understanding appears again. Not physical distance this time, but conceptual distance. The science is precise, but it is not always immediately intuitive. And when something is precise but not intuitive, people sometimes try to reframe it into simpler narratives. This is one of the reasons Antarctica occasionally appears in discussions about atmospheric research speculation or broader environmental theories online. Not because the data suggests anything unusual, but because the scale of what is being studied is hard to translate into everyday perception. Large climate models do not behave like everyday weather experience. Global atmospheric circulation does not feel local. Ice sheet dynamics do not move in ways that can be directly observed in a single moment. Everything is distributed across time and space. So understanding becomes cumulative rather than immediate. And cumulative understanding is slower to feel complete. In sleep-oriented narration, this incompleteness is not treated as something to fix. It is simply something to observe. Because the moment you stop trying to resolve every unknown, the subject becomes lighter to think about. Antarctica, in that sense, is not a puzzle. It is a long process being observed from a distance. And that distance is what keeps it present in imagination, even when the facts themselves are stable. Not as uncertainty, but as scale that exceeds everyday reference points. There are certain historical figures who become larger in public imagination than the records they actually left behind. In Antarctic history, one of those figures is Richard E. Byard. In verified history, Byard was a polar explorer, aviator, and naval officer who led multiple expeditions to Antarctica across different decades. His work contributed to mapping, navigation, and the early use of aircraft in polar surveying. That part of the record is well documented. But over time, his name began appearing in places far beyond those documented expeditions. Not in official archives, but in reinterpretations, retellings, and fragmented online discussions that blend historical fact with later speculation. This is a common pattern when real exploration history intersects with environments that are difficult to emotionally visualize. Antarctica, in this case, is not just a continent. It is a backdrop that is hard to anchor in everyday experience. And when a setting feels distant enough, the people connected to it often become focal points for expanded storytelling. Not necessarily because the original material is unclear, but because the environment leaves space for imagination to grow around it. Byard's documented expeditions were focused on exploration, aviation-based surveying, and logistical development in polar regions. These were structured scientific and military efforts, conducted in a period when Antarctic knowledge was still being significantly expanded. But later narratives began attaching additional interpretations to his name that are not supported by primary historical records. These interpretations circulate widely in informal online spaces, often without referencing verified sources, and tend to reshape his expeditions into something more symbolic than historical. In sleep-focused storytelling, it is important to separate these layers gently. Not with intensity, but with clarity. Because what matters here is not debating every claim, but understanding how historical figures become reference points for evolving narratives. Especially in environments like Antarctica, where the physical setting itself already feels remote and abstract to most people. That remoteness creates a kind of narrative openness, a space where interpretation can expand more easily than in familiar geography. And that is where historical record and later storytelling begin to drift apart. Not through a single event, but through accumulation over time. When you return to the actual structure of Antarctic exploration during Bayard's era, the picture becomes more grounded again. The expeditions were difficult, carefully planned, and heavily dependent on the limits of technology at the time. Aircraft extended what could be seen, but they did not eliminate environmental risk. Navigation remained challenging. Communication was limited compared to modern standards, and weather conditions could change operational plans without warning. Everything in that environment required adaptation rather than control. That is often what gets lost when later narratives simplify the story. Not because information is missing, but because complexity is reduced in retelling. Richard E. Bayard's role in Antarctic history sits within that reality. His expeditions contributed to mapping efforts and expanded understanding of the continent's geography during a time when large portions of it were still being actively surveyed. However, over the years, fragments of unverified accounts began circulating online that attribute extraordinary claims or hidden experiences to him. These accounts are not supported by primary historical documentation and are generally considered unreliable within serious historical research. But they persist in informal spaces, not because they are anchored in evidence, but because they offer a more dramatic structure to a story that is otherwise slow, technical, and incremental. And human attention is often drawn to structure when detail feels complex or distant. This is where Antarctica again plays an indirect role. It is not just the subject of exploration. It is the environment that shapes how the exploration feels when retold. A place without cities, without familiar landmarks, without everyday reference points. So when stories about it are retold outside academic or scientific contexts, they often become more interpretive over time. Not necessarily more accurate, but more narratively complete in a psychological sense. In sleep-focused narration, this is where the goal shifts slightly. Not to validate or dismiss every interpretation, but to observe how stories evolve when they move further away from their original context. And in that observation, something becomes clear. The distance between fact and reinterpretation is often not created by contradiction. It is created by time, repetition, and emotional framing. And Antarctica, with its scale and remoteness, naturally amplifies that effect. Even when the underlying history remains stable. Even when the records remain consistent. The space around them continues to expand in imagination, not as a flaw in understanding, but as a reflection of how the human mind processes large, distant systems. And eventually, even that expansion begins to quiet down again, leaving only the sense of something far away being slowly, carefully examined. Without urgency, without resolution, just observation continuing across time. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists when you think about places you will probably never stand inside. Antarctica belongs to that category for most people. Not because it is forbidden, not because it is hidden, but because it is far enough away and extreme enough in environment that it sits outside normal experience. And that creates something interesting in the human mind. A space that is fully real but not personally anchored. When something is real but not anchored, it becomes easier for the imagination to drift around it without resistance. That is one of the quiet reasons Antarctica appears so often in discussions about unexplained phenomena, atmospheric research theories, and older ideas like lost Antarctic maps or early exploration inconsistencies. Not because the continent itself changes, but because perception of it is shaped almost entirely through indirect information. Maps, documentaries, scientific summaries, historical records. All of these are accurate, but none of them are lived experience. So Antarctica becomes a kind of conceptual environment in the mind rather than a familiar place. And conceptual environments behave differently from physical ones in memory. They expand more easily. They accept interpretation more easily. They allow gaps more easily. If you go back through the long history of Antarctic exploration, what stands out is not a single moment of discovery, but a gradual accumulation of understanding. Early sightings, then coastal mapping, then inland expeditions, then aerial surveys, then satellite imaging, each stage reducing uncertainty in a different way. But each stage also replacing one form of uncertainty with another. Because as soon as one question is answered, attention moves to the next unknown layer. That is how knowledge tends to grow. Not as a single moment of clarity, but as repeated adjustments over time. And when you look at it that way, Antarctica stops feeling like a mystery that was solved. It starts feeling like a long process that is still being refined. Even now, even with modern technologies, even with continuous observation, there is also something important about how human attention behaves when it cannot directly verify what it is seeing. When most people hear about Antarctica, they are not seeing it firsthand. They are receiving filtered versions of it. That filter is not misleading by default, but it is limited by necessity. No single person can hold the entire continent in direct personal experience. So understanding becomes distributed. And distributed understanding always carries small gaps between pieces. In everyday environments, those gaps are usually filled quickly because people have lived reference points. But Antarctica does not offer those reference points, so the gaps remain visible. And when gaps remain visible for long enough, interpretation begins to grow inside them. Not as certainty, but as speculation shaped by distance. This is where ideas like hidden Antarctic stations or altered historical maps sometimes emerge in informal discussions, not because there is direct evidence pointing toward those claims, but because the structure of incomplete familiarity makes such ideas feel like possible ways of organizing the unknown. The important thing, though, is that the unknown in this case is not actually hidden. It is simply not directly experienced. And that difference changes everything about how it feels. Antarctica remains fully mapped in modern science. Its coastlines are measured. Its ice sheets are tracked continuously. Its atmospheric conditions are studied through international cooperation. But the emotional experience of it remains distant. And emotional distance often creates interpretive space. That space is what allows narratives to drift gently around the subject without ever fully settling. In sleep-focused narration, that drifting quality becomes the center of attention. Not resolution, not conclusion, just observation of how the mind moves when it is given a large, quiet subject with no immediate pressure to solve it. And Antarctica fits that role almost perfectly. Because it is large, quiet, and structurally stable in reality while still feeling distant in perception. So instead of treating it as something that needs explanation, it can be experienced as something that simply exists beyond everyday reach. And that is enough. When you stay with Antarctica in your thoughts for a little longer, something subtle begins to happen. The subject stops expanding outward and instead starts settling inward. Not because it becomes simpler, but because the mind stops trying to actively define it. This is where distance changes its form. At first, Antarctica feels distant in a geographical sense, a place far away at the bottom of the world. Then it becomes distant in a historical sense, a place slowly revealed over centuries of exploration. And finally, it becomes distant in a psychological sense, a place known but not directly lived. That third form of distance is the most stable one, because it does not change with maps or data. It changes only with attention. And when attention softens, even complex subjects begin to feel quieter. This is one of the reasons Antarctica continues to appear in conspiracy theories for sleep-style narratives, not as a central mystery, but as a background presence. It carries enough scale and remoteness to support reflection without demanding resolution. Older Antarctic maps, shifting historical interpretations, and early exploration records all belong to different layers of time. When viewed together without context, they can feel slightly disconnected from one another. But when viewed within their own timeframes, They are simply snapshots of understanding at different stages. The mind, however, does not always separate time so cleanly. It tends to compress. And when time is compressed, differences appear sharper than they actually are. This is where interpretations of lost maps or hidden changes often begin in informal discussions, not from a single piece of missing evidence, but from the visual impact of comparing different eras side by side. But Antarctica itself does not change in response to those interpretations. It continues to exist in the same way it always has. Cold, remote, structurally observed, scientifically measured, and only partially experienced directly by most people. That consistency is important because it separates the emotional narrative from the physical reality. The emotional narrative is fluid. It shifts depending on how the subject is framed, how much context is given, and how the information is presented. The physical reality is stable. It is defined by geography, climate, and measurable systems that operate independently of interpretation. Both exist at the same time, but they do not always overlap cleanly. And Antarctica sits in the space between those two layers. That is why it feels so persistent in quiet late-night thinking. It does not demand a conclusion. It allows the mind to stay in motion without forcing it toward resolution. And in that motion, thoughts begin to slow naturally. Not because they are answered, but because they are no longer pushed. So when you think of Antarctica now, it does not need to be framed as a mystery or a solved location. It can simply be understood as a place that exists far beyond everyday interaction, still being observed, still being measured, still being slowly understood over time. And that is enough for the mind to rest on. Because not everything distant needs to become close. Some things remain far away. And that distance itself can feel quiet. There comes a point in long historical reflection where the subject is no longer about events or maps or expeditions. It becomes about how the mind continues to hold those things after the details have already been understood. Antarctica reaches that point naturally. Because once you move through its exploration history, its mapping evolution, and its scientific presence, there is not a dramatic conclusion waiting at the end. There is only continuity. The continent remains. The science continues. The measurements keep updating. And the human interpretation of it slowly settles into something quieter. This is where Antarctica shifts again, from being a subject of curiosity to being a background presence in thought. Not actively analyzed, just lightly acknowledged. In sleep-focused narration, this is often the phase where ideas like unexplained phenomena or atmospheric research theories fade into the background rather than being explored further, not because they are resolved, but because they no longer need to be held tightly. Earlier in the narrative, Antarctica might have felt like something requiring attention. a place where maps, exploration records, and historical interpretations created layers of meaning that invited comparison. But now those layers begin to flatten slightly. Not in complexity, but in emotional intensity. The subject is still large, still real, still scientifically significant. But it no longer feels like something that needs to be mentally organized. This is an important transition in how humans process large-scale subjects. At first, the mind tries to structure everything. Then it tries to compare different versions of understanding. And finally, it reaches a stage where it simply allows the subject to exist without active processing. Antarctica fits that final stage very naturally, because it does not compete for daily attention. It does not demand immediate relevance. It remains present in global systems, climate studies, and scientific observation, but distant from everyday lived experience. That distance is what gives it its quiet character in reflective narration. Even the idea of lost Antarctic maps or historical inconsistencies in early exploration becomes less about contradiction and more about time separation. Different moments of knowledge, different levels of technology, different ways of seeing the same place. When those differences are understood as part of a timeline rather than as competing truths, the tension around them softens. And what remains is simply progression. A gradual unfolding of awareness over centuries. In that sense, Antarctica is not a fixed story. It is a long process of observation that continues to refine itself. And as that understanding settles, the emotional weight of interpretation begins to fade. Not because questions are answered, but because they no longer need to be held tightly. There is a quiet relief in that kind of release. Not dramatic, just gradual. Like letting go of something that was never meant to be carried permanently in the first place. And in that space, the subject begins to feel more like atmosphere than information. Present but not pressing. Known but not demanding focus. And slowly, even the idea of searching for meaning starts to soften. Because not everything needs to be interpreted continuously. Some things can simply remain as they are. Far away, stable, and still. When a subject has been followed long enough, the mind eventually stops trying to extract more from it. Not because it loses interest, but because it reaches a kind of natural saturation. Antarctica, in this way, becomes less like a topic and more like a background layer of awareness. Still present, still real, but no longer requiring active attention. At this stage, even the ideas that once felt more intriguing, older maps, early exploration uncertainty, distant interpretations of unexplained phenomena, begin to lose their sharpness. Not because they are resolved, but because they are no longer being held under pressure. They simply exist as part of a larger historical continuum. And that continuum does not need to be constantly re-examined in order to remain valid. Modern Antarctic science continues in that same quiet background manner. Ice is measured. Atmospheric conditions are recorded. Climate systems are tracked across long time spans. Nothing about that process is urgent in the way human stories often are. It is steady, repetitive, accumulated over time. And repetition has its own kind of calming structure, because it removes the expectation of sudden change. Even the most complex systems being studied there do not behave in sudden, dramatic ways in human perception. They move across long durations, with changes that only become meaningful when viewed over extended periods. That long view perspective is part of what makes Antarctica feel so different from other places in human thought. It is not a place of events. It is a place of processes. And processes do not have clear beginnings and endings in the way stories do. They continue, and continue, and continue, until the mind eventually stops trying to divide them into separate moments. In that sense, Antarctica does not conclude. It extends. And extension, when accepted, removes the need for interpretation. There is also something important about how distance itself softens over time when it is no longer actively questioned. At first, distance creates curiosity. Then it creates speculation. Then it creates comparison. And finally, it becomes simply part of the structure of understanding. Not something to solve, just something to accept. That is where Antarctica sits now in this narrative. Not as a mystery, not as a contradiction, not as a hidden layer of history, but as a stable presence at the edge of human experience. Known through systems, understood through measurement, and still far enough away from daily life that it remains quiet in the background of thought. And as that realization settles, even the need to keep examining it begins to fade. Because not everything distant is asking to be brought closer. Some things remain at a distance by nature. Then there is a kind of calm in allowing them to stay there. Unforced, uninterpreted, simply existing. And in that quiet space, attention no longer searches. It rests. There is a point near the end of any long reflection where everything that needed to be examined has already been examined. What remains is not new information. It is the afterimage of information. A quieter version of the same subject, still present in the mind, but no longer demanding structure or explanation. Antarctica reaches this state easily, because by now it has already been seen through many layers of understanding. Historical maps, early exploration records, scientific observation, modern satellite imaging, and the slow evolution of interpretation that formed around all of those layers over time. Each layer added clarities, but each layer also reduced the sense of mystery that comes from distance. And when mystery fades, what remains is something simpler. A large, stable presence at the edge of global awareness. Not hidden, not unclear, just far away from daily life. In earlier chapters, Antarctica could be approached as a subject of curiosity, something to trace through old cartography, expedition history, and modern scientific frameworks. There was movement in the narrative then, a sense of progression through time. But now that progression has already unfolded. And what remains is continuity without tension. This is where even themes like unexplained phenomena, atmospheric research speculation, or older ideas about lost Antarctic maps naturally lose their emotional weight. Not because they are resolved, but because they no longer feel like open questions that require attention. They become part of a broader historical background instead. And background information does not demand focus. It simply exists. Antarctica itself continues to exist in that same way in reality. It is not a place that changed shape in response to interpretation. It is a place that remained consistent while human understanding of it expanded. That distinction is important because it separates perception from geography. And once that separation is clear, much of the tension around interpretation naturally dissolves. Even scientific work in Antarctica continues in this quiet, long-term rhythm. Measurements are taken across seasons. Data is compared across decades. Climate patterns are studied through systems that do not reveal their meaning immediately, but gradually over time. Nothing about that process is abrupt. Everything is incremental. And increment, repeated long enough, creates stability in understanding. So as this narrative approaches its final phase, Antarctica does not stand as something to be solved or explained further. It stands as something already integrated into knowledge, but still distant in experience. And that combination is what keeps it present in thought, even when attention begins to soften. In the end, there is not much left to conclude. And maybe that was always the point. Antarctica does not resolve into a final answer because it was never truly a question in the first place. It was a place, a real, physical part of the planet that existed long before it was mapped and continued to exist long after it became understood. What changed over time was not the continent itself. It was the clarity of human perception. Early maps showed uncertainty because observation was limited. Later maps reduced that uncertainty through better tools, better access, and better consistency of data. Modern systems refined it further until Antarctica became something continuously measured rather than partially imagined. And through all of that, one thing stayed constant. Distance. Not just physical distance, but experiential distance. Most people will never stand there, never feel its temperature directly, never walk across its surface or see its scale without mediation through images, reports, or scientific summaries. And so Antarctica remains slightly separate from everyday life. Not hidden, or just distant. That distance is what allowed so many different interpretations to form around it over time. Older cartographic differences, early exploration records, later discussions about unexplained phenomena or atmospheric research theories. Even the recurring idea of lost Antarctic maps exists mostly as a reflection of how human understanding evolves when it moves through time and technology. But when all those layers are placed gently back into their proper context, they stop competing with each other. They align into a timeline, a slow progression from uncertainty to precision, from fragmented observation to continuous measurement, from imagination filling gaps to data reducing them. And what remains underneath all of it is surprisingly simple. The continent that has always been there. Cold, stable, observed across generations, and still continuing its quiet role in global systems without interruption. As this thought settles, there is no need to hold on to it any longer. No need to continue analyzing it. No need to search for anything beyond what is already understood. Because some subjects do not end with answers. They end with acceptance. And in that acceptance, the mind naturally begins to loosen its grip on the subject entirely. Not forgetting it, just no longer reaching for it. Like a distant place you know exists, but no longer feel the need to picture in detail. And slowly, even that awareness begins to fade into the background. Not disappearing, just becoming quiet enough that it no longer interrupts anything else. Only a soft presence at the edge of thought. And then even that edge begins to dissolve. Until there is only stillness. No interpretation. No distance. No effort to understand. Just rest.